Welcome to Stories of Change. Over the years, I have become fascinated by stories, not because they tell us what happened, but because they help us understand why it happened. In this series, I share stories from history, business, science, education, and sometimes unexpected places. Together, we explore the lessons hidden inside of them and what they can teach us about change, leadership, human behavior, innovation, and adaptation. The story is interesting. The pattern is useful. The lesson is where the value lives. So let's begin. Today, most of us get into our car and perform a tiny ritual without thinking. We sit down, reach across, and hear a click. The seat belt is now so normal that forgetting it feels strange. But it was not always like this. There was a time when people found seat belts awkward, unnecessary, and even offensive, which raises an interesting question. Why would people fight something designed to save their own lives? The modern seatbelt story begins with a Swedish engineer named Niels Bohlin. Before joining Volvo, Bohlin worked on aircraft ejection seats. His job was to help pilots escape from a fast-moving vehicle. When he moved to Volvo in 1958, his task became almost the opposite: keep people safely inside one. Earlier, belts were often simple two-point restraints. Some were awkward to use, and some placed force across vulnerable parts of the body. Bohlin designed a belt that restrained both the chest and the hips, spreading the force across the pelvis and the rib cage. It formed the familiar three-point shape we know today, and crucially, it could be fastened with one hand. Volvo introduced it as standard equipment in 1959 and made the patent available to other manufacturers. It was a remarkable invention, but invention is not adoption. Customers were skeptical. Earlier belts had earned a poor reputation. People found them uncomfortable. Some doubted whether they actually were necessary. Others disliked the feeling of being restrained. Volvo tested the design, demonstrated it, and continued gathering evidence. The technology worked. The case for it grew stronger. And still, many people did not buckle up. Australia gives us one of the clearest examples. In March 1970, a survey in New South Wales found that 75% of respondents considered seat belts important. That included almost two-thirds of the people who said they never wore one. Think about that. They understood the benefit, they agreed with the idea, they still did not adopt the behavior. This is one of the great misunderstandings of change. We assume that once people understand the case for something, action will naturally follow. Explain the benefit, present the evidence, run the campaign, deliver the training, and people will change. But knowing and doing are not the same thing. For most motorists, the possibility of a serious crash felt distant. It might happen one day. It might happen to someone else. But the inconvenience of reaching for the belt was immediate. The restriction was immediate. The risk lived somewhere in the future. The effort lived in the present. Behavioral science gives us language for this. There is optimism bias, the quiet belief that bad outcomes are more likely to happen to somebody else. There is psychological reactance, the urge to push back when we feel our freedom is being restricted. And there is habit. What we have done before tends to feel easier and more natural than what we are now being asked to do. All three were present. The crash will not happen to me. Nobody should tell me what to do in my own car. And besides, I have never worn one before. In Victoria, Australia, a parliamentary committee examined whether seatbelt use should become compulsory. The evidence supporting the belts was strong, yet many witnesses who accepted their value still opposed compulsion. The same tension appeared years later in the British Parliament. One opponent of mandatory wearing said, "We are not anti-seat belts. We are, on the contrary, overwhelmingly in favor of them." Their argument was not about whether seat belts worked. It was about whether the state should force people to use them. They were not resisting the value of the change, they were resisting the loss of choice. Nevertheless, in December 1970, Victoria, Australia, became the first jurisdiction in the world to make seat belt wearing compulsory. But the law did not work alone. During the first month, police generally educated and cautioned motorists rather than prosecuting them. In Melbourne, wearing rates rose from around 25% to roughly 50%. When enforcement began, they climbed about 75%. In New South Wales, remember, we're still in Australia, nearly 35,000 occupants were fined for seat belt offences in 1974. Education built awareness. The law established an expectation. Enforcement made the consequence immediate. And the automobile industry had to change too. It was not enough to tell people to wear seatbelts if cars did not contain reliable, accessible, and comfortable restraints. Design rules began shaping the belts, the anchor points, and how vehicles were built and certified. Manufacturers improved the buckles, webbing adjusters, and retractors. Seatbelts moved from optional accessories to be part of the car itself. Adoption was no longer left entirely to individual motivation. The surrounding system was redesigned. The safer behavior became easier to perform, more visible, and increasingly normal. There's also a warning hidden in the story. In the United States, some cars were fitted with systems that prevented the engine from starting unless the seatbelt was fastened, along with long warning buzzers. The public reaction was fierce. The technology was not always reliable, and many drivers felt that the car was trying to control them. The backlash became strong enough that in 1974, the American Congress prohibited mandatory ignition interlocks and limited the length of audible warnings. It is a wonderful illustration of the tension at the heart of change. Pushed too softly and behavior may not shift. Pushed too aggressively and people may fight the change itself. The challenge is not simply to increase pressure. It is to create the conditions in which a better behavior can become normal. And eventually, that is what happened. What began as conscious and sometimes resented action became a repeated action. What became repeated became familiar. And what became familiar became almost automatic. The click became part of driving. I sometimes think about this when organizations introduce artificial intelligence. They give people access to the technology, they explain the benefits, they publish policies, they run demonstrations, employees may agree with AI matters, they may even say it will transform their industry, and still many do not use it as part of their everyday work. Like the people in that 1970 survey, they can believe in the change without adopting the behavior, because access is not adoption. Awareness is not adoption. Even enthusiasm is not adoption. Adoption happens when a new behavior finds a reliable place in the rhythm of work. When people know where it is useful, when it is easy enough to try, when they feel safe enough to practice, and when human judgment remains visible, when the behavior is repeated often enough to become familiar. The seat belt did not succeed because of one speech, one policy, or one fine. It worked because several things came together. The design improved. The evidence became difficult to ignore. Education helped people understand the benefit. Rules changed the expectation. Reminders and consequences made the behavior immediate. And repetition slowly turned something unfamiliar into something automatic. That is worth remembering when organizations introduce artificial intelligence. Giving people access is not enough. Training them is not enough. And telling them that AI will transform the future is certainly not enough. We need to make the behavior easier to try, clearer to apply, safe enough to practice, useful within the actual rhythm of work, and repeated often enough to become familiar. We also need to preserve the human judgment because adoption is not about surrendering control to the technology. It is about learning where the technology helps and where people still need to decide. Perhaps that is the deeper pattern. People do not adopt change simply because the argument is convincing. They adopt it when the design, the environment, the expectations, and their own experience begin pointing in the same direction. The whole system gradually aligned around one small action. Click. Perhaps that is where the inner game of change begins, in the space between knowing and doing, between believing something is valuable and changing what we actually do. The seatbelt did not save lives simply because it had been invented. It saved lives when people began fastening it. The invention mattered, but the click changed everything. Thanks for listening to the Stories of Change. I'll see you in the next story.